Uh, Greetings to everyone present. I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to the ACLA and the Taiwan Normal University for giving me this platform to share my thoughts. I'd also like to convey my thanks to Dr. Anuparna Mukherjee and Dr. Arunima Bhattacharya for their engaging panel proposal entitled Crossovers, Imaginaries of Movement in Culture and Literary Aesthetics. The title of my presentation today is Neoliberalism, the Viral Vector and Larval Populations. The article looks at the politics of asymmetrical mobility regimes and how it has been further amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. It seeks to explore how the virus has inflected our everyday and quotidian understandings of mobility and brought it into close proximity with biomedical registers of interpretation. This interpenetration of pathogenic profiling and our everyday practices, care, and management of our bodies has led to a redefinition of social mobilities. The article takes at its premise the analogous mode of operation that the dynamics of neoliberal polities and the viral vector both share as liquid regimes. Yet the influx of the virus has introduced significant changes in the metabolism of the social organism, which exceed the manipulations of computational capital and thus require a more insightful analysis. The discursive trajectory of the virus binds the biosocial, the biopolitical, and biomedical in relations of mutual reciprocity, emphasizing our interconnected life processes. Against the backdrop of viral interventions, the article examines systemic paralysis and immobilities in the regime of capital circulation and reproduction on the one hand, and extreme mobilities or hypermobilities of subaltern subpopulations on the other, with a specific focus on Southeast Asia. The first section of the essay seeks to understand the pathogenic properties of the virus as framed within medical literature, while the next section looks at the imbrication of the biopolitical, the biomedical, and the biosocial, focusing on the shared constitutional chemistry of the virus and neoliberal technocracies, specifically in terms of molecular mobilities and pathogenic properties, while not discounting the emergence of more robust lines of flight and radical mobilities that the viral vector has catalyzed in the form of larval populations, engaging in public demonstrations and civic protests. Whether the virus has been artificially synthesized using sophisticated biomedical engineering in an artificial biotechnical space belonging to an advanced techno-scientific milieu, or whether it is a natural hazard of global proportions, a biochemical anomaly spawned by massive ecological imbalances, remains a debatable question, tied up with issues integral to the phrasing of the milieu as that of the virusine and the Anthropocene. We can perhaps settle with the observation that the virus comprises of a complex amalgamation of strands that are both synthetic and organic, that can be synthesized within an artificial lab environment while demonstrating organic properties guided by an evolutionary impulse. This is exemplified in the rapid mutations that the virus has undergone, raising doubts about sustainable biomedical interventions in the management and control of the viral graph. The viral influx remains a molecular process whose sporadic strikes elude the surveillance mechanism of both the organism and the body politic, or the neoliberal infrastructure of the state. The lack of visibility or visible symptoms, as in the asymptomatic, and the oscillating strike rate of the virus reproduce the mechanics of a guerrilla warfare, whose dynamics seem to preclude or elude all predictions based on mathematical modeling and statistical forecasts. Cluster infections erupt randomly, rapidly gain momentum through community transmission, and recede towards more vulnerable demographies once infection rate reaches a saturation point. This resonates with the mechanism of neoliberal polities, where capital permeates the body politic, appropriates its metabolic processes, and upon reaching the point of saturation, diversifies its production by migrating to peripheral or marginal zones in search of prospective markets for fresh investments. In light of the metabolic changes triggered by the virus, the article engages with the following questions to understand its multi-componential and imbricated ecology. What are the possible accords between neoliberalism and the pandemic, which are the points of deviation as far as the respective metabolic speeds and molecular intensities are concerned? How does the virus reformulate the decentralized politics of neoliberalism? How has the virus, as an invisible war machine, enabled new mobilities in the sphere of the everyday? How do these new social mobilities, identified as larval populations, contribute to a transformative politics of the everyday? The epoch of the virocene may be perceived as a swirl of molecular forces and their ability to engender a critical revolution in thought, transforming the deliberative space of the everyday through the introduction of novel critical dispositives. The next section looks at the imbricated nature of pathogenic infiltration, everyday rituals of social kinesis or mobilities, and neoliberal democracies. The biosocial ramifications of such an interpenetration are investigated through a process of closely monitoring the differences in the metabolic activity of the social organism with the introduction of the virus as a novel chemical intervention. Emergent neoliberal economies thrive on a politics of social metastability, where the majority of the population skirts the margins of precariousness in terms of not being assimilated into social security or welfare schemes. With the intervention of the C-19 pandemic, the operative algorithm behind the carefully crafted politics of metastability practiced by nascent neoliberal polities was upended by an exterior force, a war machine of sorts that, in an operation analogous to the molecular dynamism of neoliberalism, rapidly saturated the entire system through a process of microbial infiltration. The infinitesimal distributory networks of the virus, which could not be scanned by the naked or digital eye, enabled it to take the proportions of a planetary crisis. The viral vector and the escalating graph of neoliberalism thus seem to share the same biochemistry, resorting to modalities of sporadic capture of the host or prospective markets, causing deep-rooted systemic imbalances and structural deficiencies, in the process accelerating levels of pathogenic toxicity in the biosocial sphere. Both neoliberalism and the viral vectors stand for dysfunctional social ecologies that deactivate anthropomorphic intervention through a policy of co-option of the host, exploiting the cellular resources of the captured subject to multiply exponentially. The steady infiltration of the C-19 pandemic compromised the systemic integrity of both the bios and the nomos, saturating the socio-political infrastructure of technology-driven regimes and the corporeal self alike, and signaling an existential crisis as well as a systemic collapse that has come to haunt the contemporary biotechnical milieu. The crisis, as an event proper in the delusion sense, overrides preparedness, exposing the neoliberal state infrastructure to the onslaught of the nomadic war machine, whose dynamics outscale the containment strategies of state policies. Remaining elusive to the state's limited application of the biopolitical imaginary, constrained by the logistics of capital, the C-19 pandemic, through its spectral modalities of capture, threatens to derail our paltry defense infrastructure, upend the algorithmically calibrated flux of capital, and expose the fault lines of the system, whose combing operations have proved unequal to the task of detecting the microscopic intracellular dimensions of the virus. There is thus a conceptual overlap between the virocene and the capitalocene in terms of molecular organization and dispersion. As an organic anomaly that installed itself within the normative regime of capitalism, the virus anarchized the productive mechanics of the system and spawned its own counterproductive nefarious network that denatured and colonized the cellular mechanism of the organism, or in the case of the nomos, unsettled its capitalist configurations. The trend of social distancing which followed the outbreak of the virus, again a biopolitical strategy put into effect by the disaster management wing of state administration, was based on a complex mechanism of dispersal, where the potenza or vitalism embodied in the virus was scaled down to manageable proportions by splintering it into identifiable geospatial clusters, thus breaking down the viral load into manageable proportions to neutralize the threat of community transmission. The communitas or community space thus became a key vector of viral escalation when envisioned as a mass had to be splintered into unitary demographic profiles. Civic functions had to be suspended, and the symbiotic economic exchanges within the nomos had to be suspended to break the chain of infection, thus partially deactivating or immobilizing the economy and freezing large chunks of the service sector. The explosive outbreak of C-19 and the closure of the economy was followed by waves of internal migrations of displaced labor who suddenly found themselves out of work. To stem such extreme mobilities at a moment of crisis, the state resorted to a paranoid policing of its internal borders. Quarantining infected bodies, contact tracing, and rigorous containment strategies were deployed to isolate infection clusters. The suspension of all human traffic across borders in the wake of the pandemic confined the corporeal self within a strict grid of mobility restrictions based on a staggered politics of inclusion. This was justified as part of the state's strategy to contain a potentially lethal outbreak by isolating exposed and vulnerable demographies like unemployed workers and subjecting them to rigorous disciplinary measures. With the outbreak of the pandemic and serial lockdowns, the migrant labor force suddenly found themselves trapped in an extraordinary state of what Ghassan Hage has termed stuckedness. Cordoned off and in dire straits, they were expected to silently bear the brunt of the adversity, slowly succumbing to hunger, making themselves scarce and volatile to ease the burden on the economy. The community of stray workers skirting the perimeters of the urban technopolis were never integrated into the economic infrastructure but were selectively recruited on stringent labor policies as ground staff to prop up the systemic bulwark of neoliberal technocracies. At the hint of a first major setback, the economy was prompt enough to disgorge them from the system as pathogens, which when present in excess may escalate the levels of toxicity in an already fragile economy on the brink of a fiscal disaster. As a result, migrant workers marooned in cities were forced to resort to extreme mobilities, a word used by Pramod Nair, in a desperate drive to revert back to agrarian modes of sustenance, having suffered systemic abandonment. From a Foucauldian perspective, this could be interpreted as the granting or the withholding of immunity as an exercise in sovereign power. Whereas in progressive economies, the sovereign seeks to confer immunity on the maximum number of subjects in order to harness the forces of the bios, organize, control, monitor, and optimize their potential to propel the capitalist state apparatus. In less privileged economies where people lack access to proper health care, the state resorts to a mechanism of subtraction to shed off the excess load and reinforce buoyancy in the economy. The immunitary paradigm thus has a flip side and hinges on the formidable threat of death. Death exists as a quote, counterpart of a power that exerts a positive influence on life, that endeavors to administer, optimize, and multiply it, subjecting it to precise controls and comprehensive regulations. Wars are no longer waged in the name of a sovereign who must be defended, they are waged on the behalf of the existence of everyone. Entire populations are mobilized for the purpose of wholesale slaughter in the name of life necessity. Massacres have become vital. Close quotes. This is a quote from Foucault's essay, Right of Death and Power Over Life. I move on to the next para. Foucault speaks of an anatomopolitics of the human body which deploys the body as a machine, maximizing performativity through extortion of labor, ensuring its utility within the economic state infrastructure. To keep a tab on the logistics of population management, a rigorous screening process is deployed involving an entire series of interventions and regulatory controls, a biopolitics of the population. This two-pronged strategy of biocontrol saturates the body politic and thoroughly invests life. The managerial ethos of bodies is based on a philosophy of sustenance, an assurance of systemic longevity that has to be ensured at the expense of the precaritization of subpopulations placed at the systemic periphery with no or limited access to public health, housing, and social security. The celerity of the virus ascribes to it the properties of an invisible war machine that permeates the everyday and eludes detection by a stratified system of surveillance involving numerous checkpoints. As a corollary of the viral influx, replicating its randomized microbial proliferation, the article looks at the phenomenon of larval subjects as another instantiation of molecular mobilities inundating the social plane to engineer a transformative politics at the grassroots level. On the surface, the line of flight traced by the virus has a close affinity with the practice of neoliberalism, as they both belong to fluid regimes of operation. This explains why the operative logic of the medico-scientific discourses rolled out to contain the viral graph through stringent social curbs and mobility restrictions also decelerated the economic stridency of neoliberalism and adversely affected its market dynamics. However, the virus seems to reiterate the decentralized politics of neoliberalism with a difference. Neoliberal economies subscribe to a partial line of flight that allows for a graded crossing of thresholds. The calibrated flux of neoliberal economies is hemmed in by invisible accords based on an axiomatic of profit. The article suggests that within the viral vector, this partial line of flight transforms into an absolute line of deterritorialization, thus exceeding all invisible boundaries in defiance of an axiomatics of control based on carefully modulated flux of capital. These insurgent mobility graphs that seek to replicate the dynamics of absolute lines of flight may surface in the social space as larval populations and agitating citizens. The article closely examines how the virus has opened up possible avenues for do-it-yourself activism and agitations for the reclamation of public resources, spearheaded by activist citizens on the move in defiance of stringent mobility norms. The time frame that marks the event of the pandemic witnessed much fermentation at the level of grassroots politics, provoking public unrest and extreme civic dissensions, paradoxically at a critical juncture of social paralysis, immobilization of resources, and suspension of haptic everyday transactions. In India, the unfolding of the COVID-19 pandemic was framed by several micro-political interventions in the public sphere in the form of civic agitations and molecular mobilities outside the ambit of the representational politics. Such acts of resistance fall within the purview of a prefigurative, deliberative politics spearheaded by citizen activists and marginalized subpopulations. The time span of the pandemic brought into limelight three examples of insurgent mobilities led by disenfranchised, marginalized subpopulations. A public protest at Shaheen Bagh against an allegedly discriminatory and controversial citizenship bill designed to expunge large sections of the population from the national body through a process of ghettoization in detention camps, a sporadic outbreak of unorganized labor mobilities as evinced in reverse waves of migration from the cities to the villages following the economic shutdown in March 2020, and a peasant protest against deliberate corporatization of agriculture through implementation of a set of controversial farm laws in the midst of the COVID crisis that jeopardize the rights of the primary stakeholders, the farmers, by depriving them of state protectionism and leaving them at the mercy of the erratic flux of capital within a highly competitive, cannibalistic, cash-strapped economy. These social movements, which remained invested in the everyday politics of becoming and gained in momentum post a viral outbreak, which amplified the critical conditions in which they germinated in the first place, fast-tracking the emergence of critical hypermobilities in everyday public spheres. The loose assemblage of expelled labor hands who gathered up their meager resources and trudged back home to their native villages, often accompanied by women and children, translated into a bold statement that exposed the flawed parameters of development espoused by the neoliberal state. With the viral influx, the sectorial politics and systemic injustices of neoliberalism with its discriminatory labor policies were exposed in the treatment meted out to subpopulations, who suddenly found themselves out of work and at the mercy of market forces. The transversal mobility regimes of the beleaguered masses and peripheral subjects thus became seminal in generating spaces of civic dissent and shaping a critical public ontology at the grassroots. These molecular transformations, led by French populations, rapidly picked up momentum during the pandemic. In order to connect the disparate strands The article borrows the delusion concept of larval subjects, that is subjects who do not continuously espouse the cause of an ideology and whose politics emerge as transversal connections, born out of a sense of imperilment and imminent threat experienced in the sphere of the everyday. I think I'd conclude with that since I think I have exhausted my 20 minutes. I just have a single para, if I may just add. The article looks at in summation, the article looks at the complex intersections of strands of mobilities and their effect on social metabolism. The overlapping of the viral and neoliberal vectors of molecular mobilities opens up possibilities of a dynamic crossing of thresholds that disrupt the choreographed disequilibriums of neoliberal flows of capital. The emergence of larval subjects who permeate the body of the socius at a time of paralysis may be looked upon as radical or insurgent mobilities whose sharp lines of departure gather traction from the lines of flight traced by the virus in defiance of neoliberal technocracies. I guess I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much for your attention.